On April 12, 1961, a human being left Earth for the first time. The world remembers the name. But what the world rarely remembers is how narrow the margin was between history and silence. Yuri Gagarin did not step into space because the future was ready. He went because the Soviet Union decided that uncertainty had become acceptable. Less than a year earlier, no one could say with confidence whether a human body would survive orbit. Weightlessness was still a biological unknown. Loss of consciousness, cardiac failure, or psychological collapse were not theoretical risks. They were realistic possibilities. The reason a human launch was even considered came down to a single fact. Belka and Strelka had returned alive. Their mission did not prove safety. It proved possibility. For Soviet planners, that distinction mattered. Spaceflight did not need to be safe. It only needed to be survivable. Once that threshold was crossed, delay became more dangerous than action. The Cold War had turned space into a timeline. Every month mattered. Every hesitation carried political cost. The Soviet leadership did not need certainty. It needed confidence that failure would not be immediate or uncontrollable. That confidence rested on fragile data. Animal missions had shown that life could endure launch, orbit, and return. But animals were not humans. Human physiology, psychology, and perception introduced new variables. A person would experience fear, awareness, and anticipation in ways no test subject could simulate. Sending a human meant accepting that something might go wrong, and that the world would be watching. The question was no longer whether to send someone, it was who. The selection of the first cosmonaut was not a search for brilliance or heroism, it was a search for reliability. The Soviet system did not need a visionary. It needed a man who would function under extreme constraint, follow instructions without deviation, and survive conditions no one could fully describe. The ideal candidate was not the most talented, he was the most controllable. Cosmonaut candidates were drawn primarily from military pilots. They were accustomed to risk, discipline, and obedience. Their bodies had been tested under high acceleration and stress. Their minds were trained to operate within rigid procedural frameworks. From hundreds of candidates, the pool narrowed quickly. Medical standards were unforgiving. Psychological evaluations were relentless. Height, weight, reaction time, emotional stability, every measurable parameter was scrutinized. Even facial structure mattered, as internal camera systems would record the flight for analysis. Yuri Gagarin emerged not as an obvious choice, but as a consistent one. He was physically compact, which suited the cramped spacecraft. His medical profile showed resilience under stress. His psychological evaluations suggested calm focus rather than ambition. He did not question authority. He did not seek attention. In a system built on control, these traits were decisive. Gagarin was not told everything. No one was. Even the engineers did not fully understand how a human would respond to orbit. The spacecraft itself was largely automated. Manual control was limited, and deliberately so. The designers feared that a human pilot might panic or interfere with systems under stress. In this sense, the first human spaceflight was not designed as an act of exploration. It was designed as an experiment. Gagarin was not expected to fly the spacecraft. He was expected to endure it. As launch preparations advanced, contingency plans multiplied. Ejection systems were designed for partial failures. Recovery teams were positioned across vast territory. Medical protocols were prepared for outcomes that had never occurred before. Privately, the risk was understood. Publicly, it would later be framed as confidence. The Soviet Union did not announce hesitation. It announced readiness. But beneath that narrative lay a reality shaped by animal missions, incomplete data, and political urgency. Belka and Strelka had shown that life could return. Gagarin would be asked to prove that a human mind could survive the same journey. The step from animal to human was not a leap of faith, it was a calculated escalation. And once that escalation began, there was no turning back. Training a human for spaceflight was fundamentally different from training animals. Belka and Strelka had been conditioned to endure. Yuri Gagarin had to remain conscious, functional, and compliant, all at the same time. This distinction shaped every aspect of preparation. From the beginning, the cosmonaut training program was built around limitation rather than empowerment. The spacecraft was small, automated, and unforgiving. The pilot would not command the vehicle. He would coexist with it. Designers feared human intervention. There was genuine concern that a pilot, overwhelmed by weightlessness or fear, might interfere with critical systems. As a result, manual controls were restricted. Access codes were sealed. In theory, Gagarin would not be able to override automation unless ground control determined it was safe. Trust in the human element was conditional. Training focused not on flying skill, but on tolerance. Candidates were subjected to prolonged isolation in sealed chambers. Sensory deprivation tests removed sound, light, and external reference points. These sessions were designed to observe not intelligence, but emotional stability. Silence became a tool. In isolation chambers, time lost meaning. Candidates were monitored for signs of hallucination, anxiety, or loss of focus. Minor deviations were recorded. Repeated deviations led to elimination. The program was not searching for brilliance. It was filtering out unpredictability. Centrifuge training followed. Acceleration forces exceeded those experienced in combat aircraft. Blood pressure shifted, vision narrowed, consciousness teetered at the edge of blackout. Candidates were required to perform simple tasks under stress, proving that cognitive function could be maintained while the body struggled. Gagarin performed consistently. He did not excel dramatically. He did not fail. His responses were measured. His recovery times were reliable. In a program defined by extremes, this consistency mattered more than performance peaks. Psychological pressure intensified as the candidate pool narrowed. Competition was implicit but never openly acknowledged. Officially, all candidates trained equally. In reality, evaluations were continuous, rankings were fluid, selection could change until the final days. Uncertainty was deliberate. It prevented complacency and discouraged ego. The system favored candidates who focused inward rather than outward, those who trained without asking questions about status or outcome. Gagarin fit this profile. He was observant but reserved. He followed procedures precisely. He accepted limitations without protest. Instructors noted his ability to remain calm during unexpected changes. This trait, more than any other, elevated his standing. Unlike animals, Gagarin understood risk. He knew that previous missions had failed. He knew that contingency plans were incomplete. He knew that survival was probable, not guaranteed. Training did not shield him from this reality. It reinforced it. Medical examinations were relentless. Cardiovascular stress tests, neurological evaluations, and vestibular assessments were repeated constantly. Even minor anomalies were investigated. The margin for error was minimal. The first human spaceflight could not afford ambiguity. Despite this scrutiny, many unknowns remained. Weightlessness could be approximated but not sustained. Isolation could be simulated but not replicated. No training environment could fully prepare a human mind for the experience of leaving Earth entirely. This limitation was acknowledged quietly. The program accepted that training could only reduce risk, not eliminate it. At a certain point, preparation would give way to execution. By early 1961, the training phase approached its conclusion. The spacecraft was ready. The launch vehicle had been tested. Animal data supported progression. Political pressure intensified. Delay was no longer neutral. It was dangerous. The decision was narrowing. Training was no longer about improvement. It was about confirmation. Gagarin had demonstrated that he could endure stress, isolation, and uncertainty without deviation. He had not proven that he would succeed. He had proven that he would not fail prematurely. That distinction mattered. The program was not seeking a pilot who would overcome adversity. It was seeking one who would not interfere with the experiment. As preparations moved toward final selection, the role of training shifted. Physical conditioning gave way to procedural rehearsal. Psychological evaluation became continuous rather than episodic. The question was no longer whether a human could be trained for space. It was whether this particular human could be trusted to go first. The answer was approaching. The decision to send a human into space was never purely technical. By early 1961, the Soviet Union had reached a point where engineering, medicine, and politics converged into a single question. Who would represent the system when it crossed an irreversible line? The final selection did not occur in a single meeting. It emerged through a series of quiet eliminations. Several candidates were capable of completing the mission. Physically, they met requirements. Medically, they were within acceptable limits. Psychologically, they were stable enough. But being capable was not enough. The first cosmonaut would not simply fly a spacecraft, he would become a symbol, intentionally or not. This fact weighed heavily on the selection process. The Soviet leadership understood that the first human spaceflight would be watched by the entire world. Whatever happened in orbit would not remain technical. It would be interpreted politically, culturally, and ideologically. The candidate had to survive the mission, but he also had to survive its aftermath. This introduced criteria that had little to do with flight. Public composure mattered. The ability to speak clearly mattered. Facial expression mattered. Even height and posture mattered. The first cosmonaut would be filmed, photographed, and analyzed frame by foreign intelligence services and global media. Yuri Gagarin fit this role naturally. He was not imposing. He was not aloof. His demeanor was open, calm, and controlled. He appeared confident without appearing defiant. In a system that valued predictability, this balance was rare. Equally important was what Gagarin was not. He was not politically outspoken. He was not ambitious in a way that challenged hierarchy. He did not project individualism. Other candidates possessed strong technical skills or exceptional flying experience. Some were more assertive. Some were more charismatic in private settings. But these traits introduced uncertainty. The system did not want a personality. It wanted a vessel. Behind closed doors, discussions acknowledged risk openly. If the mission failed, the cosmonaut would die publicly. If he survived, he would be elevated instantly to a level of visibility that could not be controlled indefinitely. This made selection a defensive process. Gagarin's background reinforced confidence. He came from a working-class family. His path through military aviation aligned with official narratives of social mobility and discipline. His biography could be told cleanly, without contradiction or complication. In the Cold War context, this mattered. The United States was expected to frame the mission in ideological terms, regardless of outcome. The Soviet Union needed a figure who could absorb that attention without generating internal friction. Gagarin's psychological profile played a decisive role. Evaluations described him as emotionally resilient, cooperative, and responsive to instruction. Under stress, he did not withdraw or overreact. He adapted. In simulations involving unexpected changes, he followed procedure rather than instinct. This was critical. The spacecraft, later known as Vostok, offered limited control. In many scenarios, the cosmonaut would be forced to wait rather than act. Impatience or improvisation could be fatal. Trust, not brilliance, became the deciding factor. By March 1961, the outcome was effectively determined. Official confirmation followed soon after, but the internal decision had already solidified. Gagarin was assigned as the primary pilot. Others were designated as backups. No public announcement was made. Secrecy remained absolute. Even within the program, knowledge was compartmentalized. Gagarin himself was not informed of the final decision immediately. This was intentional. It reduced psychological pressure and prevented premature identification. The system moved forward as if nothing had changed. Training continued. Procedures were rehearsed, medical checks intensified. Outwardly, all candidates remained equal. Inwardly, the path had narrowed to one. The choice of Gagarin was not a gamble, it was a calculation. Belka and Strelka had demonstrated biological survival. Gagarin was selected to demonstrate human compliance within the same unknown. The transition from animals to a man was now complete. What remained was execution. The next chapter would not be about selection or preparation, it would be about commitment. Once the spacecraft was sealed, the system would no longer be able to reconsider its choice. The spacecraft that carried Yuri Gagarin into orbit was not designed to be flown. It was designed to operate without him. This was not an insult to the pilot's skill. It was a reflection of fear. By 1961, Soviet engineers understood rockets better than they understood people. Machines behaved according to equations. Humans behaved according to emotion, perception, and stress. Variables that could not be fully controlled or predicted. The designers of the Vostok spacecraft faced a dilemma. They needed a human aboard to prove that spaceflight was survivable, but they did not trust that human to make decisions once the mission began. Weightlessness introduced unknown psychological effects. Would disorientation impair judgment? Would fear cause panic? Would a pilot attempt to intervene at the wrong moment? These were not hypothetical concerns. They were openly debated within the program. The solution was automation. Vostok was programmed to manage nearly every aspect of the flight autonomously. Launch, orbital insertion, attitude control, and re-entry were all handled by onboard systems or ground commands. The cosmonaut's role was observational. In effect, Gagarin was a passenger. Manual controls existed, but they were deliberately restricted. In early mission profiles, access to full control was locked behind coded mechanisms. The codes were sealed and intended to be used only if ground control determined that the pilot remained cognitively functional. This precaution was unprecedented. It reflected a lack of confidence not in Gagarin personally, but in human response under unprecedented conditions. Engineers feared that a conscious but impaired pilot might act in ways that jeopardized the mission. Trust was conditional. The spacecraft did not assume rational behavior. It assumed risk. From the pilot's perspective, this created a unique psychological burden. Gagarin was trained extensively, yet he knew that his ability to act would be limited. He would be present during the mission, but largely unable to influence its course. This was not how pilots were accustomed to operating. In aviation, control was central to identity. Pilots trained to respond, adjust, and compensate. In Vostok, those instincts had to be suppressed. The safest action, in most scenarios, would be inaction. Training reinforced this restraint. Simulations emphasized observation and reporting rather than intervention. Gagarin practiced monitoring instruments, describing sensations, and confirming system status. He was conditioned to wait for instructions rather than improvise. This design choice reflected a deeper philosophy. The mission was not intended to explore space actively. It was intended to observe the human response to space. From the system's perspective, the cosmonaut was a variable within an experiment. His value lay in endurance and communication, not decision-making. This approach carried risk of its own. If automation failed, the pilot's ability to recover the mission would be limited. Engineers accepted this trade-off. They judged the risk of human error to be greater than the risk of mechanical failure. The spacecraft's design revealed an uncomfortable truth. The first human spaceflight was not an act of trust in humanity's readiness. It was a test conducted despite doubts. Gagarin understood this. He did not protest the limitations. He did not argue for greater control. His acceptance of the spacecraft's constraints reinforced the decision to send him first. Compliance was not a weakness in this context. It was a qualification. As launch approached, the balance between human and machine was set. The spacecraft would fly itself. The human would endure the experience and report what it felt like. This arrangement defined the nature of the mission. Gagarin would not conquer space. He would pass through it. The final preparations reflected this reality. Procedures were finalized. Contingencies were reviewed. The mission architecture assumed that once the rocket left the ground, outcomes would unfold according to plan, or not at all. There would be no dramatic mid-flight corrections. There would be no heroic improvisation, only execution. With the spacecraft sealed and the pilot committed, the program crossed its final threshold. The remaining uncertainty could no longer be reduced through design or training. It would be resolved by launch. The final hours before launch were quiet by design. Noise created risk. Emotion created uncertainty. The system favored routine. In the early hours of April 12, 1961, Yuri Gagarin was transported to the launch site under conditions of strict secrecy. There were no speeches, no symbolic gestures, and no acknowledgement that history was about to be made. Officially, this was another test flight. In reality, there was no precedent. The spacecraft had flown before. The rocket had been tested. Animals had survived orbit. A human had not. Gagarin followed procedures that had been rehearsed repeatedly. Medical checks confirmed stability. His pulse and blood pressure were within expected ranges. No signs of distress were recorded. This data mattered. The launch would proceed only if the pilot appeared physiologically normal. The spacecraft was sealed hours before liftoff. Once inside the capsule, Gagarin was alone. Communication with ground control remained open, but physical contact ended. From this point forward, the mission would unfold without intervention. The environment inside Vostok was restrictive. Movement was limited. Visibility was narrow. The instrument panel was functional, not intuitive. There was no window designed for observation, only small viewing ports intended for orientation confirmation. The spacecraft was not built for comfort or experience. It was built for containment. As the countdown progressed, systems were activated sequentially. Fueling operations concluded. Telemetry links were verified. The launch vehicle entered its final configuration. Engineers monitored hundreds of parameters simultaneously, watching for anomalies that could force a delay. None appeared. At ignition, the transition was immediate. Acceleration forces pressed Gagarin into his seat. Vibration increased sharply. The sound of the engines overwhelmed all other sensory input. For several seconds, the spacecraft behaved exactly as designed and exactly as feared. This was the most vulnerable phase. A failure at launch would leave no margin for survival. Escape systems existed, but their effectiveness at low altitude remained uncertain. Engineers watched telemetry with heightened focus, waiting for the rocket to clear the tower. It did. As ascent continued, acceleration increased. Blood shifted under force. Vision narrowed briefly. Gagarin reported his condition calmly, confirming that he remained conscious and oriented. His voice mattered. Ground control listened not only for words, but for tone. Any sign of confusion or panic would trigger contingency protocols. None came. Stage separation occurred as planned. With each successful event, the mission moved farther from recovery and closer to irreversibility. Once orbital velocity was achieved, there would be no turning back. Weightlessness followed. For the first time, a human body experienced sustained freefall beyond Earth. Orientation cues vanished. Physical sensation changed abruptly. Gagarin described the experience with precision, noting the absence of gravity and the altered perception of movement. This commentary was not optional. His observations were the mission's primary objective. Telemetry confirmed stable physiological readings. Heart rate increased slightly, then normalized. Respiration remained steady. There were no signs of loss of consciousness or severe disorientation. The spacecraft entered orbit. At that moment, the experiment succeeded. The Soviet Union had placed a human into space, but the mission was not complete. Orbit did not guarantee survival. Systems still had to function. Re-entry still loomed. The most dangerous phase had not yet occurred. From the ground, confirmation was received quietly. There were no public announcements, no immediate declarations. Internally, the mission transitioned from ascent to observation. The world would not be informed until success was assured. Gagarin continued to circle the Earth, unseen and unheard beyond a small network of engineers and controllers. He was no longer accelerating, no longer ascending. He was waiting. The launch had answered one question. It had not answered the final one. That answer would depend on whether the system, human and machine together, could complete the cycle and return. Once the spacecraft settled into orbit, the mission entered unfamiliar territory. Launch had been violent and brief. Orbit was silent and continuous. For the first time in history, a human being was not falling back to Earth. He was moving sideways fast enough to miss it entirely. This condition had no precedent in human experience. Inside the capsule, Yuri Gagarin adjusted to weightlessness almost immediately. At least, that was how it appeared from telemetry and voice communication. His breathing stabilized. Heart rate remained within acceptable limits. Muscle tension decreased as acceleration forces disappeared. What mattered was not comfort. It was cognition. Engineers and physicians had feared that weightlessness might impair mental function. Loss of orientation, nausea, confusion, or panic were realistic possibilities. In extreme cases, it was feared that a pilot might lose the ability to communicate altogether. Gagarin did not. He reported sensations clearly and methodically. He described the feeling of floating. He noted how objects behaved when released. He observed how his body responded to the absence of gravity. These reports were not spontaneous reflections. They were structured observations delivered according to training. The Earth appeared in fragments. Vostok was not designed for sightseeing. Viewing ports were small and functional. Still, Gagarin could see the curvature of the planet, the transition from light to darkness, the thin atmosphere separating Earth from space. These observations were relayed to the ground. They were brief, controlled, and deliberate. There was no room for poetic reflection during the mission itself. Every transmission had purpose. Ground control listened for clarity, continuity, and coherence. The most important confirmation was psychological. Gagarin remained oriented in time and space. He understood where he was, what was happening. and what would come next. There were no signs of dissociation or sensory overload. This alone justified years of preparation. The spacecraft continued its path silently. One orbit was all the mission required. More would increase risk without adding essential data. The goal was proof, not endurance. Vostok was designed to complete a single revolution around Earth and then initiate re-entry. During this time, automation governed nearly everything. Attitude control kept the spacecraft stable. Environmental systems maintained oxygen and temperature. Communication windows opened and closed as the spacecraft passed over tracking stations. Between those windows, Gagarin was alone. This isolation was absolute. There was no visual contact with Earth-based observers, no continuous dialogue, only intervals of connection separated by silence. This aspect of the mission had been underestimated during planning. Isolation was not simply physical, it was cognitive. Gagarin was aware that no one else had ever been where he was. He knew that the mission depended on systems beyond his control. He understood that survival now hinged on re-entry, a process he could not influence, yet his voice remained steady. This steadiness carried weight beyond the mission itself. It demonstrated that a human could remain composed while entirely removed from Earth, suspended in a hostile environment, dependent on machines for survival. The orbit progressed. Day became night. Night became day. The planet rotated beneath the spacecraft at immense speed. Gagarin's presence above it lasted less than 2 hours, but its implications would last decades. As the spacecraft approached the point where re-entry would be initiated, attention shifted from observation to anticipation. The most dangerous phase still lay ahead. Orbit had proven survivable. Return had not yet been tested in a human mission. The success of everything that had come before, the animal flights, the training, the automation, now depended on whether the system could complete the cycle it had begun. Gagarin was informed of the upcoming sequence. He acknowledged calmly. There would be no manual intervention, no decision-making. The spacecraft would execute its programmed commands. Gagarin's role would be to endure and report. The orbit was nearly complete. The experiment had reached its final stage. And once re-entry began, there would be no way to stop it. Re-entry was never a formality. It was the phase that had ended more missions than any other. As Vostok approached the point where descent would begin, the spacecraft prepared to perform a sequence that allowed no correction. The braking engine was scheduled to fire for a precise duration, slowing the capsule just enough for Earth's gravity to pull it back. Too little deceleration, and the spacecraft would skip off the atmosphere and remain in orbit. Too much, and structural failure would be likely. The margin for error was measured in seconds. The engine fired. For a brief moment, telemetry indicated normal performance. Then an unexpected problem emerged. The service module, which housed non-essential systems, failed to separate cleanly from the descent module. This had not been planned. The two sections remained partially connected, causing the combined spacecraft to tumble violently as it entered the upper atmosphere. From the ground, data became erratic. Orientation readings fluctuated. Communication degraded. Inside the capsule, the situation was physically brutal. The tumbling motion subjected Gagarin to rapidly changing forces. Heat built along the capsule's surface as atmospheric friction intensified. The structural load increased. For several minutes, the spacecraft was no longer behaving as designed. There was nothing Gagarin could do. Manual control was unavailable. Intervention was impossible. The outcome would depend entirely on whether the mechanical connection between the modules would fail on its own before the capsule lost structural integrity. Eventually, it did. The remaining connections burned through under extreme heat. The service module separated completely. The descent module stabilized into its intended orientation. The worst phase had passed, but the danger was not over. As the capsule descended further, acceleration forces increased sharply. Gagarin experienced forces strong enough to make breathing difficult. Blood pressure surged. Vision narrowed. Despite this, telemetry showed that he remained conscious. At high altitude, the final contingency activated. Unlike later spacecraft, Vostok was not designed for a fully controlled landing with the cosmonaut inside. Instead, the system ejected the pilot from the capsule at altitude. Gagarin was expelled from the spacecraft and began descending separately by parachute. This aspect of the mission was not disclosed publicly at the time. Official narratives would later describe a single capsule landing. In reality, survival depended on two separate systems functioning correctly under extreme conditions. Gagarin's parachute deployed. Below him, the capsule descended independently. The landing zone was not precise. Atmospheric conditions and descent dynamics pushed both pilot and capsule off course. They landed far from the intended recovery area. When Gagarin reached the ground, he was alive, but alone. There were no recovery teams waiting, no prepared landing site, only open countryside and civilians who had no idea who had just arrived from the sky. The mission had succeeded, but not according to plan. From a technical standpoint, the flight had exposed weaknesses. The separation failure, the violent tumbling, and the off-target landing all revealed limits in the system. These details would remain classified for years. From a biological standpoint, the outcome was clear. A human being had survived launch, orbit, and re-entry. The most dangerous minutes in the history of exploration had ended not with spectacle, but with quiet survival. The world would soon learn of the achievement, but the full truth of how close it came to failure would take much longer to emerge. What remained was to understand what this flight changed, and what it cost. That belongs to the final chapter. The world learned about the flight only after it was over. That timing was deliberate. Once confirmation of survival reached Moscow, the narrative was released in controlled form. A human had gone to space. A human had returned. The details that did not fit this arc were omitted. What mattered was the headline. For the first time in history, Earth was no longer the boundary of human presence. The psychological impact was immediate and global. Space was no longer theoretical. It had been entered and survived. The name Yuri Gagarin became synonymous with that moment. Within days, Gagarin was transformed from a test subject into a symbol. He was presented to the public as confident, composed, and victorious. Images circulated worldwide. Statements were translated and repeated. The Soviet Union had achieved what had seemed impossible only months earlier. Behind the image, reality was more complex. The flight had revealed vulnerabilities. Automation had failed partially. Separation had been imperfect. The landing had deviated from plan. Survival had depended on redundancy and chance as much as design. None of this was emphasized. The system required clarity, not nuance. Ambiguity would weaken the message. The Cold War context left little room for open discussion of risk. Gagarin's personal experience was subsumed by the narrative. He became a representative rather than an individual. His life after the flight was defined by visibility and obligation. Public appearances replaced training. Symbolic value replaced operational role. This was not accidental. The system that had selected him for reliability now relied on him for continuity. He embodied success without threatening authority. He was visible, but not autonomous. In private, the implications of the flight continued to shape decision-making. Engineers revised spacecraft designs. Medical teams refined protocols. The risks encountered during re-entry informed future missions. Lessons learned quietly improved safety margins. The boundary crossed on April 12, 1961, was not crossed cleanly. It was crossed cautiously, imperfectly, and at real human risk. Belka and Strelka had proven that life could endure space. Gagarin proved that a human mind could endure it too. Together, these missions marked the end of uncertainty and the beginning of responsibility. Spaceflight could no longer be dismissed as speculation. It demanded systems, ethics, and accountability. Each subsequent mission would build on foundations laid by experiments that had never been guaranteed to succeed. The legacy of the first human spaceflight is often framed as triumph. It is more accurately understood as transition. Humanity moved from observing space to inhabiting it, however briefly. The consequences of that shift continue to shape exploration, technology, and how societies measure progress. Gagarin did not conquer space. He demonstrated that it could be entered and survived by an ordinary human under extraordinary constraints. That distinction matters. The flight changed the balance of perception, not because it was flawless, but because it was irreversible. After April 12, 1961, there was no return to a world where space belonged only to imagination. The sky had been crossed, and everything that followed would have to reckon with that fact.